My name is Brian, and I am just the regular guy that likes to work on bikes. I work out of my garage and do not have special facilities or tools. I like working on older or broken bikes and seek simple yet effective solutions to everyday bike problems. I had a customer request I rebuild his wife's first bike as a birthday gift, of which I cheerfully obliged. I even remember my first banana seat bike and now wonder if it was a Schwinn like this one. The Fair Lady Stingray is ubiquitous with the 1970s kids bikes, offering a smaller frame with options for tassels and a playing card in the spokes. This bike was built in October 1979, very close to the heyday of the Stingray style bike, and even though they did start to fade in popularity as BMX bikes became more prevalent, lately they have resurged as a classic style that is gathering some momentum as a fun ride. The bike did have all original equipment as far as I was able to determine, including the original paint, chain, and grips. The head badge was still there, so I also recognized that this was something to preserve. What I found most interesting was the fact it had a bicycle license from Salt Lake City, Utah. Because that is something not typically seen, I always try to preserve that as much as possible. Now, let's dive into this project. The breakdown of this bike was in some aspects easy, in others a real chore. I removed the wheels with no real thought of the strategy I planned to use for reconstructing, only because I wanted to concentrate on the other components. I noticed that the spokes and rim are rusted, as well as the missing coaster brake retention clip, but all that will be handled in due time. Chrome fenders are also interesting, although common for that era. The amount of rust was to be expected. However, there was quite a bit. Usually kids are not kind to their bikes, as I clearly remember I was not either. The chain was definitely in bad shape, and although the chain sported a master link, the overall condition did not merit a recondition, but rather simply be replaced. Even I thought it was too stiff and would probably not work out in the end. I removed the master link with some difficulty, but as you can see, the chain was not good at all. The bottom bracket was stiff and needed a complete overhaul, since most of the bearing cages and bearings were rusted with no hint of grease. I didn't know if they were beyond repair, but later cleaning will determine what I can expect to do. The crank removal went as expected, with most of the threads being rusted and requiring some penetrating solvent to remove. I also had to be careful with the chain guard, as I did not want to strip the screws. As seen here, the rust was prevalent and no grease at all. The pressed and buried cups did not cause any issues. I also tried to remove the kickstand, but that was welded on the frame and not removable. I then removed the seat and the seat supports, discovering the screw holding the seat support also holds the rear fender in place. Something to keep in mind when rebuilding. It's so interesting to review the older seat posts that were a simple steel tube with brackets, not the molded alloy or carbon fiber of today. The rear fender came off next without too much issue, without any real dents or damage. I expect both of them to clean up nicely. The seat clamp was rather stuck and required a few whacks with a mallet. It was a little difficult to remove the bolt holding the front fender due to the fact that it was buried in the fender well and not easily accessed. I finally dug out a spanner that was a standard measurement to not damage the bolt face and still allowed me to create torque. I removed the head badge with unique and difficult to replace screws. I even dropped one, and that caused alarm as it is small, dark, and there are too many places for them to hide. The major issue I had was removing the quill stem. After using my typical PVC hack to hold the fork in place, I really struggled to remove the lock nut. It was not just seated, it was rusted in place. I soon realized I needed the bigger guns. I tried double PVC pipes, then tried a mallet, and only placing it on the floor with some WD-40 and my heat gun and elbow grease, I was finally able to remove it, but twisted the stem in the process with the required torque I had to apply. Since I'm not a strong guy, I resorted to some aggressive tactics. Because of what I had to do to remove it, I did scrape the headset lock nut a little. Once I was able to loosen the lock nut, I thought I was out of the woods once I started removing the stem. What a mistake! I had to perform the same strategy as I did with the lock nut on the headset. After a bunch of work and effort, the stem did eventually loosen its death grip on the fork. I saw the threads on the stem retaining bolt and the wedge nut and did not have a good feeling from all that rust. But again, I am not determining anything yet, just observing the major issues as identified. With the stem out of the way, I returned to the headset. Since I had not removed the lock nut previously, just loosened it, I heard the squeaking as I removed it, another big indicator this bike has been out in the weather. With the knurled cone nut, I expected to have no issues, but apparently I had not learned from my previous experience and soon struggled to use enough leverage that I could grab the nut. After trying by hand, I finally resorted to an adjustable wrench to get the right purchase. Even then, I tried to use some rags to avoid damaging the edges of the race. When that wasn't enough, I returned to my heat gun and some brake fluid and gave it something that might loosen it. I even hit it with my mallet, trying anything that would loosen that rusty thread. After some agonizing minutes, it finally relinquished its hold on the fork and I was able to extract it. It was then that I understood the reason why the headset and stem were so difficult to remove. The fork steerer tube had split from the pressure of the quill stem and the added rust contribution. This was a first for me, and it is a testament of the forces of nature in being able to stress the steerer tube, even if it is made with practically indestructible steel. Removing the headset bearing cups was practically a non-issue compared to the other problems. As for the steerer tube matter, although it was quite concerning, I do have a plan that I can fix using my meager welding skills. We will see shortly. Now I started in on the frame preparation. The joints were poorly made, even out of the factory, something I did not expect from Schwinn. The Schwinn brand is or was synonymous with quality and has always been seen as a decent bike manufacturer. However, with what I saw here, there were a lot of areas of concern that should not have passed quality control. Since I was repainting the frame, I opted to perform a little cleanup as well, using my Dremel tool to remove burrs and irregular surfaces. I removed a lot of the rust and paint with a sanding sponge, trying to provide a smooth surface for the next coat. I used several tools to clean up the frame, which I highlight here. Number 1, Dremel cutoff wheel to improve metal issues, deburring weld joints, etc. Number 2, paint removal wheel, wire wheel, used to remove rust and paint as best possible. Number 3, sanding sponge, smooth some of the paint levels and frame imperfections. 4, polishing stone, clean and deburr seat stay and chain stay joints. Number 5, file, also used to deburr and flatten certain areas. I provided some examples of what I did, and even though I was not perfect, I did improve the overall finish of the original frame quality. The chain stays were a definite issue as the joints had rough seams that I simply could not leave as is. I did the best I could, but this process was slow and tedious. I used a file, sanding disc, cutoff tool, and polishing stone, depending on the location and what I was trying to do in order to remove imperfections. Even then, I didn't do as good of a job as I should have, but at least it looked better than it did. I did mask off the bike license, hoping that I would be able to preserve it for the future paint coat. I wanted that to continue as part of the legend that this bike was during its heyday. To prepare for painting, I had to make sure I could fix the fork issue. With the split in the steerer tube, this was going to be interesting. I was definitely breaking new ground with this bike as I had not had extensive experience with welding, but figured since this was to be hidden by the head tube, it wouldn't be too critical I do an awesome job. I cleaned the fork as best I could to remove all of the rust that I could, but also knew that welding doesn't care too much about rust. It will weld the rust along with the clean metal. I started with banging the steerer tube down to a diameter that would be close enough to remove the crown race. With the crown race off, I then started removing rust and paint. Using my wire wheel in my vise, I was able to remove quite a bit without exposing the fingers to too much damage. After the rust removal, I attacked the split. Here is where I did the best I could because all I was trying to achieve was a union between the two edges of the steerer tube so that it wouldn't cause issues later. Since the original split was the product of a combination of things, age, rust, and over-tightening of the stem wedge, I didn't want this to occur again, so I needed a clean, strong weld, even though my abilities to do so might be in question. Regardless, I did weld the fork as best I could, with the intent I would file and sand down any excess to allow me to reinsert the crown race. Although it looked ugly, and I am sure any competent welder would cringe at the result, I think I was able to at least get the results I wanted. After filing and grinding down the excess, it started looking a little better, and I did not see any of the original split, creating a homogeneous pipe as before. I did learn something interesting. I shouldn't use a rag as a catch for sparks and flying pieces of molten metal. They cause fires. I doubt a wooden table was much better, but at least I didn't need a fire extinguisher. Live and learn. Once I was able to sufficiently remove the rust and some of the paint on the frame, I then started in the cleaning process. I typically use isopropanol as a cleaning agent to remove paint residue, rust particles, and to expose any imperfections I might have missed. Since this wasn't an exhaustive cleaning and my assumption the paint would better mask any mistakes, I erroneously took less time to clean the paint, concentrating on the rust as the major nuisance. I did mask off the kickstand to avoid paint. I was unable to remove the kickstand since it was welded to the frame. I realized with the first actual coat I should have given it a quick filler primer coat and used that as an aid in filling low spots and uneven paint blemishes, but I have never been too patient for paint in the first place. After hitting the local hardware store for what paint colors they had, I originally opted for a nice fluorescent pink, but when applied I learned that it was semi-transparent and did not cover the bare metal. I then had to return for the other two pink colors to see which I liked better. The lighter color had promise, however after application I didn't like the clarity and instead favored the darker pink to stand out as a pink bike. I used the lighter pink for the chain guard. As luck would have it, my painting skill leave a lot to be desired, therefore several coats later and after a botched clear coat, it started to look better. Not ideal, but passable for what my skill would attest. This is partly why it took me well over a week to paint, as I left significant time between coats to hopefully reduce any orange peel or wrinkling. The chain guard also suffered from some paint run, and the paint itself was behaving weirdly, something I did not see in the past. Because I was under a time crunch, I had to accept the undesirable results to get this bike done in time for the customer. As with most rebuilds, I like beginning with a headset and fork installation. Considering the fork was so bad and I was concerned that I would have issues with the weld job I did, I opted to perform that one first. Fortunately, the build was straightforward and not as much of an issue as I feared. I started with cleaning the head badge and removing the dirt and some speckled black paint. Mineral spirits and alcohol were all I used to not attack the original paint. The headset, although dirty and rusty, was not as bad as I initially thought, since the chrome underneath preserved the finish and it was an easy cleanup. The Dremel wire brush made quick work of that. The bearings were a little bad, but after cleaning them with some solvent and wire brush, I considered them clean enough to reuse. The cones and cups were fine after a little elbow grease. Since I had really banged up the lock nut, I figured I had so many of them that I could find a replacement that wouldn't show so much wear and tear. Even then, the threads on the fork were quite bad and I had to resort to chasing the threads with the lock nut. When I started the installation of the head badge, I had to be extremely cautious to not lose the two screws. They were two of a kind, so to speak, and easily lost. I dropped one and my heart raced for a second, but was able to locate it without too much issue. I banged down the bearing cups, being careful they seated completely. I then put on the crown race on the fork, and although there was a little catch at the repaired split, it did go on correctly. This time I did use my crown fork seating tool. I didn't have the right diameter PVC pipe. I added the greased bearings and fork to the frame. As I added the top bearing cone, I had to be extremely cautious to not cross thread. I then replaced the seat post. My intent was to use it to hold the frame in place while I worked on the rest of the frame, but it was smaller than the diameter my bike stand could hold. Regardless, as with most of this bike, it was cankered with rust. I still was able to clean it up with a wire brush and install it on the bike without too much difficulty. The crank, although rusty, was not overly difficult to clean since the chrome offered a relatively good barrier to any corrosion. Considering I had removed all the crank components, including the crank, bearings, cones, lock nut, and the bearing cups, this was not a difficult task to clean up. I used my new Ryobi instead of my Dremel due to it being more powerful, also to test it out as to the effectiveness it should provide. Briefly stating, it met my expectations. The hardened steel of the cups was an easy clean, making sure to clean both the inside and the outside. I decided to use the Ryobi and coarse steel wool on the outside. Here you can see the difference between the two cups. I then followed with soaking the bearings and cages. Because so much time had passed, the bearings were as to be expected. I simply cleaned them, paying attention that they were not rusted, which to my surprise was the case. With the bearings percolating, I then attacked the crank with the fine steel wool. I am always pleased to see the quick results the steel wool will provide to unchromed surfaces. This time was no exception. I then concentrated on the bearings that were definitely done with their solvent bath. After working on them a little while, I was able to see that the patina was not worn, no doubt because although the bike was out in the elements, it was not used and therefore was not ground or worn unnecessarily. I then cleaned the bearing cone with some steel wool and a cursory pass on the lock nut with my Dremel. They are usually not bad if the bearings are not damaged. From there, I mounted the cups on the bike, tapping them in with my mallet and confirming they seated correctly. I dunked the bearings in grease and slipped them on the crank arms and into the bottom bracket. Sliding the bearing cone and lock nut with a simple adjustment was the last step on the crank installation process. Simple yet effective design. The last step was to clean and install the pedals. Since I was unable to disassemble the pedals, I simply cleaned them as best I could and injected grease where possible. One of the pedals had no problems rotating, but it moved too freely, indicating it had no grease. I then added some so that it moved freely but not too much. The other pedal was definitely stiff, but some wiggling and coaxing allowed it to start to move freely as well. I buffed them as best possible to remove as much tarnish as I could. From there, I returned to the bike and installed the pedals on the crank, pre-greasing the crank arm threads as I did and using my 15mm spanner to lock it down. Remember, the left pedal is left-hand threaded, so to not bind when pedaling should that occur. The stem, handlebar, and grips were another interesting aspect of this bike. Remember, I twisted the gooseneck stem because of the amount of rust and corrosion that caused so much trouble during the removal process. I figured I would be able to use another stem since I always keep a bunch of extras. More on that in a little. After inspecting the handlebars and grips, I tried to keep them and not have to replace. I always liked keeping the original equipment. However, it was somewhat doubtful I would be able to reuse them since they were so old, and I didn't know if they were pliable enough to remove without damaging. After some time, with my mineral spirits and holding the stem in my vise, I was finally able to remove them without undue damage. It wasn't easy, but patience and some elbow grease were all I needed. After inspecting, it did appear that, although stained, they might be recoverable. I then removed the handlebars from the stem and went off to see if I could find some replacement stem. After rummaging around a while, I thought I found a good candidate with a possible runner-up. I tried to match the age, material, color, and overall dimensions of what I am replacing. I cleaned up the replacement stem, removing any junk on the thread and wedge nut, and polished the stem itself. I also took advantage of the opportunity to clean up the handlebars, partly to confirm the fitment on the stem, but also so I could install everything on the bike at once. I cleaned the grips using a nylon wire brush and a combination of mineral spirits to remove the oily and greasy residue, and a concerted effort of water and vinegar solution and isopropanol to remove the pinkish stains, which I assume were microbial. I was not overly optimistic I would be able to remove anything, but with some patience and a little cheating with some steel wool, I was able to get them to look rather awesome. Once I had everything cleaned up, I tried installing the stem on the bike and found the dimensions were off. It was slightly larger than the original, therefore I had to resort to resurrecting the original stem. Since it was twisted from the disassembly, I was concerned it would be an issue here as well. I was able to straighten somewhat with the vise using the handlebars as a lever. Another issue was the fact the wedge nut and bolt were so cankered with rust, I was concerned I would not be able to use them, meaning the thread would not hold. I resorted to using my vise to remove the bolt, and once I cleaned it up, it was passable but not fantastic. Provided the wedge nut and threads are not seen, I was not too stressed and did the best I could in making it functional and crossed my fingers the thread would not strip. The fenders, although not overly rusted, were to be expected for the chrome finish. Older chrome seems to be better coated than newer stuff, and this bike was no exception. After removing the hardware, I began with my standard fine steel wool on the chrome finish. It does a decent job of removing the rust. There was a slight patina on the chrome that simply would not come off, but it was not too noticeable once complete. I also tried to remove as much rust as I could from the inside of the fenders just to improve the appearance as much as I could. Since this is not as noticeable, I could be a little more aggressive with the removal technique. I then cleaned up the hardware and proceeded to install on the bike. Since I did not have the nuts and bolts ready for the rear fender, I had to leave the stays alone until I finished the seat. Now I started on the wheels. At first, I thought I would simply be able to replace the tires since they were old and brittle, as would be expected from a bike of this age. However, after review, it was obvious that they were using a 20-inch by 1 3/8 inch tire, something quite difficult to find today. I compared the original wheel to a newer BMX wheel and could see that they were definitely not the same diameter. The tires were obviously worn and cracked, completely unusable for restoration. Okay, so I looked at the wheels that came on the bike, and they're English, meaning that they are not metric. So basically they were 20 by 1 3/8, which the 1 3/8 is very common on a 26-inch bike. I've not really seen that on a 20-inch bike. However, the rim was just slightly wider or just slightly larger than the current one. So this is, I found a couple of wheel sets that I think might work as a replacement, because I just don't think I'm gonna have really a difficult time finding the tires for them. They just don't make them anymore because they don't exist. Everything is now pretty much BMX style and BMX measurement. So I did find these two sets here. I'm gonna have to debate which ones I actually do want to use, because this one has steel rims, so maybe not best quality, but this one, the front wheel is really chewed up. It's really beat up. Somebody rode on it without any tire, and I don't know if I really want to use that. But again, the cool thing is that the little added bonus was that the bike did not have the arrestor retaining clip for the coaster brake, and this luckily came with one on it already. So I think I got smart when I took this off the old bike whenever I scavenged it, and I left it on there thinking that someday I may need it, and now's the day. So I may go with the steel rim, only because they're kind of more like the style of the Schwinn Stingray bike as it is right now. But again, I'll have to debate. The other thing is that the hubs on these alloy rim wheel set, it's a little rusted, but they do rotate well. So I'm not really concerned about that. Actually, it's seems to be like a pretty quick, put on a new set of tires and tubes, and it'll be fine. I did find, and I was thinking I wanted to go with some white tires. That'd be really nice, but this is a little old. So I found these GT. I mean, they're much more. They're not going to really fit necessarily with the Stingray style. Kind of, that was the original tires that were on the bike as well. The original Schwinn tires that I could see there. Actually, they had them printed right on there, Schwinn. So those were the original tires. It's completely destroyed. There's no way I could even have a chance to use those as a potential recycling of those tires or being able to use them. So because these are brand new, I think I want to go with this. I'll either go with these, unless I get lucky and find some white tires. I'd rather have some white because I think that would fit better with the bike the way it is. We'll see. So anyway, but more on obviously diving into this thing and seeing what I can do as far as replacing the wheels, and like I say, about halfway through the bike now as far as the rebuild is concerned, and this will save me quite a bit of time by using these recycled wheel sets, which would definitely help me out, because the spokes were not that good. If I were to look at them now,
So here's the old wheel, and it's, of course, it's stiff here, rusted on the rim, so obviously rusted on the hub. But the biggest thing that I find to be a concern is the fact that the spokes are really rusted, and they're actually, I think they're double-butted spokes, which is really nice. I mean, it would really be awesome if I was able to use these, but because they're so rusted, I'm just like, nah, I don't think it's going to be a good idea. So anyway, so we'll just let this wheel set go. Maybe I'll recycle them later, or I'll do another video on these to show how to refurbish these and set these up so that they actually would be able to work on another bike. But again, I really don't see how I can do that, because if I don't have the tires to go with these things, I mean, it's going to be very difficult for me to be able to work with it. Anyway, so let's dive into the rest of this and see what we can do.
Between the two sets I identified, I decided to go with the steel rim wheels, mostly because they were closer in color and type to the originals, and also because the hubs were in decent shape, not requiring any servicing at all. They were, for the most part, true as well. For the front wheel, all I needed to do was add rim tape to protect the tube from the spoke nipples and potential punctures. I installed a brand new tube with the wheel, and I will normally partially inflate the tube to seat it correctly in the tire. Once I have the tube inside, I will deflate the tube once more to aid in the installation on the rim of the wheel. I did decide to use the GT racing tires because they were new, and I knew that they would last longer than if I were to try to find some other white tire set, and to give it a sportier look, more indicative of the Stingray bike style. I wasn't sure if it would look good, but went with them anyway. After seating the tire on the wheel, I did some minor cleaning of the hub with the Ryobi tool to remove some minor rust, and then it was back to the bike for installation on the fork. This was harder than it looks because I found that the inserts for the front axle were very small, and the newer axle struggled to make it inside. I had to force the fork open to slide over the ends of the axle in order for it to seat correctly. I even debated grinding off the fork opening, but reasoned that it would make the front fork unstable in the case the nuts were to loosen up. After a lot of yanking and struggle, I was finally able to get it on the fork. From there, it was a simple act of tightening the nuts on the wheel. For the rear wheel, I did remove the sprocket to better clean the hub with my brass wire brush, as well as to inspect the internal mechanism. I did not see any major issues, and the hub did spin freely without play. I actually was quite impressed with the quality, even though cheaper materials were used. There was a little rust on the sprocket, but a quick cleaning with my Ryobi helped remove that. I replaced the sprocket and added the lock spring to hold it in place. When installing the tire, it is smart to confirm the circumference of the tire is equally seated on the rim, as the tires do have a tendency to bunch or not seat on the bead correctly all around the rim. It is not a major issue, but may cause some imbalance in the distance from the hub. Most people wouldn't even notice the difference, but extreme cases cause improper rolling and a bit of a balance that is bothersome. After verifying the stem was pointing to the hub, I then inflated the tire to the full pressure rating. From there, I installed the rear wheel on the bike. I started by loosely tightening the nuts to hold the wheel on the bike. With the coaster brake as it is, the anti-rotation lever also needs to be installed, and it is usually easier to do so with the ability to rotate the hub, a somewhat difficult job with a bike on a bike stand. I didn't tighten the rear wheel yet, since I will still need to set the length of the chain later. Since I planned on using a new chain, I cleaned it in some mineral spirits to take off the factory grease. I usually will wax my chains anyway, so this is just a step in the process. After cleaning and drying, I then measured the length to the bike to determine the lengths of chain I needed to remove. Single track chains usually have a master link, which I prefer. I do have another earlier video of me showing the removal and installation of the master link on a chain. This particular link did give me some issues because it did not have a slip link, but instead was installed by pressure. Once I was able to add the link, I then loosened the nuts holding the rear wheel and stretched out the chain to the correct tension. I typically will walk it out, alternating from one side to the other until I have the correct tension in the chain and the rear wheel aligned with the bike frame. Usually sight alone is sufficient for determining the correct alignment. From there, I check that there is no binding on the rotation of the chain caused by over-tightening. A slight amount of slack is necessary to avoid that. Now I save the hardest part, or at least the biggest unknown, for last, the seat. Since it was in poor condition and I knew that the ability for me to restore would be the crowning jewel in this difficult project, it would definitely make the final results pop as I wished. I knew that would be the eye catcher for the customer as well. I first started looking at seat replacements on eBay and other locations, but all were at least $30, something I was not ready to pay. So I opted for restoration, my common theme. I checked around for some covering, and that was when I found that the local hobby store had vinyl fabric sheets for a very economical price, something that I was much more inclined to pursue. After grabbing a yard for less than $5, I figured that if I messed up and completely botched it, I could learn with my first attempt to do a better job the second time. I began by removing the retention hardware and then removed the support bar on the back, the easy part, cleaning and polishing the stays at the same time. I then attempted to separate the two sections, the one with the seat covering from the steel insert. Unfortunately, after a couple tries, realized I was going to have difficulty doing so, partly due to the rust, but also because it appeared that the grommets for the support stays were pressed through both sides. This was not going to be as easy as I thought, so this meant my first attempt would be exposed on the bottom of the seat. I cut out a section of the vinyl that I thought would be sufficient, and then started figuring out the way I would be able to attach it to the seat. I assumed an accordion-like approach would be best, but the dedication and attention to detail is paramount. I thought the best approach would be to soften the fabric a little with some heat, so I hit it with my heat gun for a little bit. After softening the fabric, it wasn't exactly like I was hoping, where it would be simply molded to the contour of the seat, but it didn't look too bad either. Since the fabric was white, any tiny smudge was instantly noticeable and did not lend to the overall clean appearance. Therefore, I had to be as careful as possible not to dirty it with anything permanent. As I cut up the cloth to fit the basic shape of the seat, I quickly learned I was out of my league trying to do this, but it also did not look too bad. The glue gun did hold it, and the basic appearance on the outside wasn't bad, just sloppy underneath. Since I didn't feel I could do a better job trying to do this again, I let it go and vowed I would do better next time. Once I finished the upholstery, the final installation wasn't too bad. I perforated the holes for the screws to mount the rear seat support, and in turn mounted the seat on the bike. It was rather straightforward without issues. So as a wrap up on this project, I was able to keep costs down and not overspend as I typically do. The new components I required were the chain for about $7, the new tires for about $12 a piece, new tubes for about $5 each, the seat covering for a tad under $5, and about $18 in paint. I was able to scavenge other used parts for the wheels, the headset lock nut, and the coaster brake retention strap. All other components were original and did not require replacement. Therefore, including a nominal cost for the used parts, the grand total came out to $72.55. So this was a great project and I'm happy with the results, especially considering it caused me to do things I typically do not do on a bike. I learned a lot and will definitely apply knowledge to the next project. As far as the bike was concerned, using the BMX tires with some knobbies really gave a girl's bike that might be seen as soft a bit of a rougher aspect that strangely enough worked for this bike. Once I was able to meet the intended user, I was glad I took that route, and I saw her personality fit the bike to a T. This is how the bike turned out. Some before and after shots.